Hey everybody, two Alpha Gals here. I'm Debbie Nichols.
And I'm Candace Mathis, and you're listening to In the Tall Grass, where we're sharing stories of reinvention, resilience, and rediscovering joy.
Whether it's facing Alpha Gal syndrome or any other redefining chapter of life, we all have to learn how to navigate the journey through the tall grass. So here we go. This episode is sponsored by Insect Shield. One of the mottos we live by is don't live in fear, live aware. Well, Insect Shield is one of the companies helping us to do just that. Insect Shield's EPA-registered insect repellent apparel makes it easy to protect yourself from insects that could potentially cause disease.
But did you know the company has a program to insect shield your own clothes? You send your clothes in, Insect Shield treats them and sends them back to you with durable and effective protection against not just ticks, but also mosquitoes and other biting insects. Check out insectshield.com for more info. And you can save 15% on your first purchase and support 2 Alpha Gals today with code 2AlphaGals. That's TWO Alpha Gals. Hey, everybody. So today we are super excited. We have Maeve Willis here with us today. Maeve is a business owner, performance coach, licensed social worker, competitive athlete, and food allergic patient. We actually had the privilege of meeting Maeve at the Fair Summit this year, and we learned that food allergies for Maeve have been both an obstacle as well as a defining part of the path forward for her life. So Maeve, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, we're so excited to have you. So we know you wear a lot of hats, figuratively and literally. So from strength coach to mental performance coach, from retired competitive Irish dancer to currently competitive Olympic weightlifter. I mean, we're like blown away with all that you've accomplished and all that you continue to accomplish. Can you share just a little bit about your journey and what drew you to these different sports and activities?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm absolutely the type of person who loves to say yes to things. And if it's not a hell yes, it's a no for me. And that's really a defining way that I look at things. And I started Irish dancing when I was 5 years old. My parents are Irish immigrants to the United States, so the rest of my family lives over in Ireland. It was a way for me to kind of connect with an Irish community here, and I fell in love with it. I'm a really rhythmic person, so it became like a really just interesting, unique way to express myself. But then I was a soccer player through high school. I played collegiate rugby and collegiate ice hockey. And it was just kind of like really defined by like, this sounds really interesting. And then you go and start it and you're like, oh man, the people that are here are my kind of people. And the more that you spend time with people that think like you, the more you recognize your opportunity to grow and amalgamate some of the lessons that they've learned into the way that you express yourself and what you're choosing to go after as well. So everything from that first Irish dance class that I did to now my currently competitive career in Olympic weightlifting has really just been like, how can I go after something that's really interesting and engaging and that I can be a nerd about and learn and continuously learn and never be a true master at it and feel like there's still growth that I can continue to chase. And I've always just kind of felt magnetized by those sorts of things.
I love that it's growth that drives you, which explains a little bit, I think, about why we were drawn to you when we heard you speak at Fair, because we could see how you were using even the negative things that, some people might consider them negative anyway, to drive your growth. And that is just absolutely beautiful. You're working now as a mental performance coach, right? Mm-hmm. Specifically
Yes.
Focusing on female athletes.
Yeah. So that work has been really interesting because I think that the world of mental performance coaching is in comparison to other parts of sport really new. And being willing to separate mental performance coaching from explicit social work or explicit psychotherapy is really interesting, and trying to bring out the best in athletes so that their performance is the best on the mental side of things is really interesting. But if you consider the access to resources when it comes to competitive sport, the vast majority of resources are going to be dedicated towards male athletes. And as a female athlete, I recognize that through my entire athletic career. Like when I was in high school, my twin brother played soccer as well. It was expected that the men's team was in the weight room and the women's team was not allowed in the weight room. And this was only 12, 13 years ago, right? So the progression of sport has just really been dedicated towards the male side of things. And I wanted to recognize that the impact of sport on my life has impacted me outside of sport as well. But that my gender did play a big role in that. And if I was willing to dedicate a space towards helping female athletes to navigate some of the inherent inequalities in access to resources and how that actually impacts their mental performance in sport, then it was beyond simply helping an athlete, and it was recognizing that identity could be something that could be changed from somewhat of an obstacle to somewhat of an opportunity.
Which is such an amazing mindset to have. Like, when did that kind of click for you? Were you a teenager?
Yeah, I think I was. And what's interesting is through the progression of my Irish dance career, through the end of high school, I did kind of what was socially expected in the sport. You get into the weeds of Irish dance, and it's absolutely not what you expect when it comes to the costume, the hair, and all those sorts of things. And after college, I actually returned to Irish dance on the competitive side again with the full intent of saying, I want to show up as my authentic self, which to me was not wearing a dress, which at the time was this mind-blowing, like, who are you type of thing. And you're still showing up with your hair done and looking the part, but I was wearing pants. And that idea of I'm allowed to be a female in the sport, but I'm still allowed to authentically represent myself on a stage was really interesting. And it allowed me to come back to the sport in a way that let me fall in love with it all over again. And I think that even things that are inherently feminine can be approached from so many different angles that female athletes a lot of times can get boiled down to a singular identity, but expression of femininity through sport should be more of a spectrum. And I think that the more that you give female athletes space to own that, the more that spectrum is going to continue to be widened.
I'm curious, how was that received when you decided to show up as your authentic self in this sort of traditional sport that you're doing?
Yeah. Honestly, it was a mixed bag. There were definitely some folks in the community that voiced to me their I guess shock is a good word, but definitely without necessarily vocalizing their own disapproval of the choices that I was making. But at the same time, I had younger girls come up to me and say, hey, like, I really like your costume, and run away, as if that was, something that they were like, oh, excited about, but like unsure how to communicate, right? And being an older athlete in that sport, I think that really changed what I understood my calling to be in that sport, because it can be so traditional and so competitive as well. But if you continue to ascribe to the societal norms, it can be really hard to show other people why this matters, right? Beyond aspirations for a podium, you're doing that sport because you love it and because that sport has changed your life. And if you, in the expression of that sport, are not showing up as your authentic self, it shows. And and what's interesting is that I think that to a certain degree, my placement, it absolutely shifted, and I was definitely placing much higher when I was showing up as my authentic self. But I think also at a similar note that there was probably a certain degree of judgment from judges that I wasn't placing as high as I possibly could have because of the way that I was expressing myself on a platform. I was absolutely all right with that because I was doing the absolute best that I could representing myself in that way. And that to me felt way more important than the aspirations of a podium.
Yeah, and it's so beautiful. I mean, and I wonder, were you at this time, were you either participating, I don't know if that's the right word, were you receiving mental health care at that time? Because I know that this is where, now you are a licensed practicing social worker. So
yeah,
was that a part of your journey to wanting to help other people, as a career? I would love to just kind of hear the progression of that.
I actually I was receiving mental performance coaching at the time. And I think that distinction is really interesting because I think that a lot of mental services are assumed to be therapeutic, where this was really like performance centered. And so that degree of coaching was really what gave me the reflection that I needed to feel like this was the right choice. Which then kind of immediately after concluding my career in Irish dance, I actually then transitioned, went to graduate school, and then continued to pursue that. So I would say that it actually had a pretty dramatic impact on me.
I think that's amazing. And I think I can see as you're talking about this, the growth that you did draw from this, both your experience as coming into the sport space as your authentic self, but then also the impact that this mental performance coaching has had on your actual performance, but then also your life choices.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so inspiring also because hearing your story in the pieces that it is, you were really young at that time. And I think that it's so inspiring and impactful when we have these conversations with people that kind of come into this wisdom at a very young age, because you also were navigating food allergies at a young age. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting that you bring that up because I intentionally connect the two of them. And I think that having food allergies encouraged me to find a voice much earlier than I think a lot of my peers had to figure that out by, right? So I think that, when you grow up inherently different, right? And with food allergies at the time, strict avoidance was the only way forward. But as well, it wasn't as common. And I mean that through my own experience, not from a statistical perspective, but the severity of the allergies that I had one friend in elementary school where we would sit at the peanut-free table in the opposite side of the cafeteria. In middle school, I actually would eat lunch in the nurse's office and could bring a friend on Fridays, and that their lunch was checked by the nurse and that sort of thing. And then all of a sudden, you're at this formative age where you're 12 and 13, and the social life that most people experience during that lunch hour is now me having conversations with typically 65-year-old white women whose life experience is really different. And so the relatability is really different. But then as well, the ownership for you to be able to express to an adult and to your peers as well, the severity of your food allergies requires a certain degree of confidence in the way you express yourself. And so I think that it's not something that I wish on anybody, because I think it does force you to grow up a little bit faster, as lots of other experiences might encourage you to do as well. But I do think that having food allergies did bleed into my understanding of self-expression in other areas of my life in such an inherently positive way. I can't imagine who I would have been without food allergies.
What I find so fascinating about the way that you talk about food allergies is that you are expressing to us, to our listeners, the positive impacts that the food allergies have had from your experience. There are so many roads you could go down when you're talking about food allergies or other chronic diseases or alpha-gal syndrome, anything like that. There are so many ways to get trapped in that negativity. And I don't think I heard a single one, because even as I was listening to it, I'm thinking about all the changes that still need to be made, right? Like I could get on a soapbox about the allergy table and isolating children in these formative years.
Right.
But instead, you were talking about the positive impact it had on how you learned to speak with adults. And I think that was one of the things, it was like an aha moment for me when I was listening to you speak at FAIR. And someone asked if you could have a magic wand that made all your allergies disappear, would you accept it? And you can look around and we're surrounded by people with food allergies and everybody's sort of nodding yes, right? It is hard. Let's not pretend it isn't. We have to make a lot of changes. We change our lifestyle. We change everything, right? But your response to that question was no, you didn't want to make your allergies disappear. Can you talk a little bit about that and explain why that's so?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that that there are certain formative experiences in any given person's life that you can look from two ends of the same spectrum and view them as an inherent positive or an inherent negative. And when it comes to chronic conditions, and something that you either are dealing with on a daily basis, whether that's kind of like an expected or a I don't know if unexpected is the right word, but what I mean is something more akin to a diabetic who regularly has to check their blood sugars, where for me, it's really like, hey, I need to make sure that I'm vocalizing. I need to make sure that I'm avoiding. I need to make sure I'm cooking my own food. All of those sorts of preventative measures, right? I think that it's really easy to fall into the trap of woe is me and frustration, and all of those things are absolutely valid. And like you said, living with food allergies are really hard. And this is a chronic condition that is really easy to dismiss, especially if you handle it really well, because people don't recognize how much goes into the works of your daily basis and making sure that you do things well because you handle it really well. And so then they're like, oh, it's not really a big deal, until they recognize the severity and the life-threatening nature of it, right? But I think to return to your question, like the idea for me of dismissing something that has changed me at such a core level would mean that I would experience the world in such a different way. And my human nature and the way that I approach obstacles and challenges would be inherently different. And it's really interesting to have grown up with a twin brother and an older brother who don't have food allergies, and to recognize the differences despite our shared childhood experiences in the way that we go after problems, is just really interesting. And I think that when you have a chronic condition like food allergies, you are more able to understand that there are barriers and obstacles in other people's lives that you can't see. And you are more willing to meet people where they are, to ask the furthering follow-up questions that are necessary to have deep, authentic relationships with people really quickly, that allows you then to live a life that's more full. And I wouldn't trade that experience for the world.
So you just continue to like blow my mind. I'm like over here going, I mean, because it's so, you're a young person, you know, like it's just incredible to hear that you approach life this way, you know, because it is, I mean, I think something we've not touched on is how many food allergies you actually have and how you are anaphylactic to these allergies. Like you were saying, like Debbie and I completely relate. Like when you are living with this condition, we are kind of flirting with death a lot, you know, like we try to pull the positive out of this, but that's the truth, right? Like it impacts every move you make, every place you go, who you spend your time with. I mean, there's a lot of trust that goes into navigating this world.
Right.
So can you share your food allergies and at what age were you diagnosed? Were you born with these allergies?
So this is the story as I understand it. I think that my parents might have a different perspective that they would share if they were here. But I was a NICU baby. I was pretty ridiculously premature. And as I understand it, this was the era of being in the NICU where when you're tiny, they're like, great, we're gonna fatten you up a little bit and give you a little bit of peanut butter. And then I exploded. And so like my first near-death experience was I think I was like 2 or 3 days old at the time. And so then full panel of allergy testing comes back. I think at the time I was 7 of the major 9. And I have a couple additional ones as well that are not included in the major 9. But this has been something that has been from day one, type of a thing. But what's interesting is that I went through, I don't know, probably a good 15, 16 odd years without then another like major like episode, which is absolute credit to my parents navigating the challenges of having a kid that could die at a given exposure, right? But then, you know, you go through the navigating independence that you want as a teenager, going through college and all those sorts of things, and those exposures that I didn't recognize, and you know the things that were no longer then in my parents' control, and I didn't recognize that I had to control. Those exposures exponentiated, and I would say that I probably sitting pretty around 20-ish anaphylactic exposures right now, which I recognize also is a privilege. And to a certain extent, you know, the vast majority of people that have this condition, that have those types of severities, don't make it through that many, right? And this is something that took me a couple of accidental exposures to really comprehend the severity of it. Where I think it's really interesting when other people have near-death experiences, right? And a lot of times when you have that experience, you return to your life and you ask yourself these big questions, like, is my job fulfilling? Are the relationships that I have on a daily basis fulfilling? Like, am I the person that I want to be, given the fact that, hey, life is way more precious than maybe I was giving it credit for? And as I started to have more of these experiences, I started to ask myself that question more regularly, to the extent where I would be on my probably 7th or 8th anaphylactic exposure, and I'd return to my life and absolutely nothing would change, because I recognized that the choices that I was making on a daily basis were informed by this recognition and understanding that life is precious, and that because of my chronic condition, I am more likely to have an exposure that is going to result in death, but not in a morbid sense, in a really like activist almost sense in my own life, where I'm like, sweet, I am going to do exactly then today everything that I want to And every choice that I'm going to make is going to be something that has a significant amount more weight to it than other people may realize, right? Like it is absolutely possible that you take a step off a sidewalk today and you get hit by a bus and that's the end of you. And I think that risk is more true for more people than maybe they realize. But in living with this type of chronic condition, you're forced to face that earlier than most people are. And then the question becomes, what do you do with how that helps you to reframe your life?
What you just said right there, I think is what, if I could convey anything to anybody out there who is living with allergies now in fear, this is what I would want them to hear. Because what Candace and I face with alpha-gal syndrome is prioritizing, right? We have to prioritize what is important to us. If I go outside, am I going to get bit by a tick? Yeah, there's a chance. It doesn't matter if you're in the city. It doesn't matter if you're an outdoorsman. It doesn't matter. There is a chance you are going to get exposure. What we have to do is decide if that is going to stop us from going outside. For me, for Candace, for so many people that we know that are learning to live with this and navigate it, we're deciding that it's not going to stop us. No, I am not going to run naked through the tall grass without doing a tick check after the fact. I'm going to study and learn and be aware and take these preventative measures. Right. But I'm going to go out knowing there is a chance that there is going to be a tick on me. But the value of going outside is my priority. And I also know, and I'm sure you do the same thing too with your anaphylactic reactions. You have a plan in place. Should something happen? Should you be exposed? So you're taking all the preventative measures, you're staying aware, you're not living in fear so that you can live a fulfilling life. So what you said, I think, is so, so important for anyone out there listening to this to hear, to evaluate what their priorities are. And I just think, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
How old are you?
I'm 31.
Yeah, well, you look even younger than that, but I never would have guessed because you have the wisdom of somebody who is so much older than that. And it's obvious that you've channeled all of these experiences into making yourself a better person. And that is so cool. That is so cool, Maeve.
Yeah. And you talk so much about reinvention, right? Like, I think that was something, I don't know if you know this, but that's one of our pillars with Two Alpha Gals, is to help people reinvent their lives to find resilience and ultimately joy. And you have been doing that your entire life.
Yeah.
Your entire life, right? It's like, it's the reevaluation. And when I hear you talk, I've been to the ER probably 12 times with anaphylaxis and probably more and didn't realize it. And it does give you this gratitude for, I've even tried to do that when I'm in the ER, like, thank you for putting me here. Just let me get through this and I'll educate, I end up educating all people, which I know there's mixed feelings about that, right? Like, I get that, but in that moment, that is what helps me overcome a very scary situation. And 100%. You've done that your whole life. So I'd love to maybe take a minute and talk about exercise, because that's something with alpha-gal syndrome that a lot of people know. When you're having a histamine response, exercise can be a cofactor.
Yeah.
To elevate your reason. 100%. I've dealt with that. Have you dealt with that? And how do you overcome that? Because that is a huge part of your life.
Oh my gosh. So this is so interesting. And actually, probably without even realizing it, this is something that I actually had to handle yesterday. Okay. So I had on Sunday a minor reaction, and it was something that I could kind of do my thing, control, watch. I understand how things feel, how things progress, that sort of thing. And woke up yesterday and I was like so excited to train. Just like, oh, this is a great day. And then I remembered that I'd had the reaction the day before. And I was like, shoot, I can't train today. This is so frustrating. And I think that a younger me would have thrown caution to the wind and, just done the thing that I enjoy, right? But I actually have had an experience with exercise-induced anaphylaxis, where I was probably about 21 or so, where had a reaction, well controlled. About 8 hours later, I went to the gym, started warming up, and then very quickly realized that I was not okay. And that was the scariest of the anaphylactic reactions that I've had, because the rest of them were really like, I ate this thing or got exposed to this thing and I'm headed to the ER. I know exactly what's happening. And at the time, nobody had educated me about exercise-induced anaphylaxis, despite having had this condition for my entire freaking life. Like, that was a moment where I was like, I don't understand what's going on, but I can't breathe. I'm covered in hives. Like, what is happening here? And I think one of the more interesting and really challenging symptoms of anaphylaxis to describe to someone who doesn't have an allergic condition is the sense of impending doom. And that mental recognition of the moment where you're like, I am going to die. And it's like, I'm like tearing up as I'm describing this, but like, it's one of those moments of gravity where you recognize how close you are flirting that line. And that experience in particular scared me more because I didn't understand what was happening. So since then, I act in an abundance of caution. So if I have any sort of minor reaction, despite being the type of person that really has what I would call a pretty good handle on it and a big awareness in my body, like I'm the type of person that like doesn't necessarily alert other people as a reaction starting. I'm just going to keep an eye on this sort of thing and let them know if things progress, because I don't want to involve other people that really don't understand it and elevate stress and all of that. But exercise-induced anaphylaxis is something where I don't want to chance it. I don't want to risk it. But then as well, I get so much daily joy out of pushing my own boundaries and seeing what's possible. And so I feel frustrated quite a bit when I have to tell myself no. And when those days inevitably happen, and I'm lucky that I've controlled enough elements in my life where that's pretty rare. I would say maybe once every 8 months or so, I have to take a day like that where I'm like, nope, I'm protecting myself and my future here. It's something that I struggle to describe to other people that don't have a condition like this, because in their eyes, I'm being abundantly cautious, and maybe I am, and maybe I really do have the opportunity to train that day, but I'm not willing to take that risk. Which is frustrating, because that's all I want to do. I want to push boundaries. I want to see what's possible with the human body and my own body. And those days can make things very frustrating. So I think that, having exercise as a cofactor is something where no matter what, you have the possibility of doing something today that makes you healthier tomorrow. And whether or not that exercise is you doing static stretching for 40 minutes because you recognize that your hips are chronically tight, and the time that you would have spent doing something that elevated your heart rate and respiration rate and triggered an anaphylactic response is not something that you can do today, but you can actually make progress on your hips. Or today is going to be one of those days where you spend that same time working on some other part of yourself that really is still going to progress you forward. Maybe it's not exercise, but you still do have some low-hanging fruit of some other part of you that you can progress in that time, and that's okay, and that the gym's going to be there tomorrow, I promise, and you're going to be all right, and you can move forward.
You said two things. Well, you said so many things. You said two things I want to touch on. First, impending doom. I'm so glad that you verbalize that, because I don't think that people understand that is actually a symptom of anaphylaxis. I mean, there are a lot of people who do understand. I think there are a lot of people who don't understand.
Yeah.
And having that validated for me by a mental health professional was huge, because then I could go back and I could be like, so when I was telling that doctor on the cruise ship that I knew I was going to die and he needed to do something about it to save me, and he was going, no, 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 you're fine, you're fine, you're fine. I was right. I was the one who was right. And so I think the more we can talk about that, the better. Second, I think that this is a fantastic turn on your comments earlier about prioritizing, right? Like, we don't want our allergies and our life, we don't want these diagnoses to stop us from doing the things that we love. But there is a time when you do need to evaluate your situation and decide the best way to move forward, so that in the future, even if you can't do something today, you can get back to doing it in a really healthy way. So thank you for sharing both of those things. I think that's super valuable.
Yeah, it's huge, because I remember you were making me get all teared up too when you were talking about it, because that was the first reaction that I had anaphylactically that I knew of, that I had to use my EpiPen. And I had to convince my husband, and he is the closest person to me, and he is so validating and all of that. And it's when you're feeling, Debbie and I talk a lot about this, of feeling that dropout, or like almost like you're going over a railroad track in a car really fast, and you just feel that dropout. That's the feeling that I experience with impending doom. And I just think we all have to share our experiences with people that are closest to us and those that aren't, so that they can start speaking up for themselves too, and speaking their needs. And it's okay, right? Like, it's okay. And it's okay if you've been a strength trainer for 10 years and now you just need to walk on a daily basis to get back to a place where you feel comfortable picking up weight again, or, really all of this experience. I know for me, because I was a strength trainer for so long, and then overnight was couch bound, and it was very taxing on my physical, mental, emotional health. Everything suffered, that time. And I think that giving ourselves permission to do something different is okay. And do you have any advice for people that might be like I was at that time, kind of having to start over? Is there, do you have any tips or, I don't know, coping strategies for kind of shifting? Because you have to shift your mindset to say, I just need to get up today.
Yep.
I
think the biggest thing that I can suggest is shifting your expectations. Because I think that it's really daunting to say I'm not who I was. And especially with I empathize, but can't actually understand what the two of you have gone through, and as well, people with adult onset food allergies, right? Like your experience and their experiences are so different to mine, because I'm so used to it. And this is just ingrained in me, where I am like, I'm like, all right, here's a different obstacle. I gotta do this way today, right? Like, was I frustrated yesterday? 100%. Am I so excited to get under a barbell today? Absolutely. But like, I think it's really interesting when you consider that these chronic conditions impact people at different parts of their lives, right? And sometimes this can be at 7 years old. Sometimes this can be at 65, right? And you have to go then through a process of understanding, all right, like, who am I in this process? And how does my identity then play with the way that I'm going to take action today? Is this a permanent identity that I'm shifting into today? And this is who I'm going to be for the rest of my life. Can I still have the same core values that I did yesterday before this experience happened? Or does this experience actually change how I look at myself and how I look at the world? And necessarily, does that mean that the actions that I take and the things that I prioritize on a daily basis change? And I think that it is daunting to allow an experience to shift your identity. But if you are able to recognize how that identity can stay consistent with who you are, and that everything that you've learned up until this point is now not, it's not like it's not valid. It's now just pulling in a different way, and maybe something else is taking a higher priority. And once you call that shift out, it's way simpler to see what your next action step is.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing advice. And I wish that I would have heard that almost 5 years ago because I needed it so badly because I yearned for the person I was the day before, right? Like, it's like, how did my life shift so drastically in 24 hours? And it's so needed to hear that you just need to make like this little like mind shift. So I'd love to know, speaking of just your performance coaching, is that something that you offer to people online? Do you work with a lot of food allergic athletes? Or, you know, if I wanted to say, hey, Maeve, I want to work with you, can you build out a exercise program that kind of like, do you offer that kind of service?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting. The reason that I made a face like that was I was just trying to kind of take a mental poll of the people that I work with. I would say that maybe I have 2 or 3 people that I work with that have chronic conditions, whatever they are. But I think what's really interesting as well is that to some people, the identity of their chronic condition is a really high priority to them. And to others, it's almost so low on the list that I've actually had some people entirely forget to tell me about this for like 4 months and then mention it in passing. And I'm like, hang on a second. Has this always been true? And I think it's really interesting, right? Because over the last 15 years or so, we've seen a real societal shift towards identity and labeling yourself as something. And some people really ascribe to that. And I think that can be really empowering, where for others, it's not necessarily the same. And other people feel like an identity really ties them in with everyone else that has the exact same expression or the exact same condition. I think that both are valid, right? Like, if I were to introduce myself to someone, I'd probably mention the fact that I wear mismatched socks before I say, oh, by the way, I have a peanut allergy. And because that matters to me more in my expression of self and how goofy a person I am, and, you know, like, what I chose for the patterns on my socks and how I bring intention to my day as a result of those patterns, right? Like, all of those things matter to me more than you understanding, hey, I'm not going to shake your hand because I noticed that you were eating something that I'm allergic to. I think 10 years ago, that would have been different because of the experiences that I'd had up until that point. And not that either one is more or less valid, but I think that it's just interesting to me how some people prioritize that in their introduction, and therefore what to me resonates with how high in your identity that condition actually is, and how happenstance other people seem to be about it.
I love that. And it makes me feel very introspective too. Like, I think about what my own personal priorities for my identity are. If you were to like list the top 3 things about your identity, what would they be? Mismatched socks? Because I love that, actually.
I would say probably first and foremost is athlete. Just because of how formative those experiences through sport have been for my entire life. I would say probably second is some sort of amalgamation of queer and Irish American, because all 3 of those are really interesting in the way that they play into each other. And I wouldn't prioritize one over the other. They're kind of this odd collection of identities together. And then I would probably say 3 is goofball. Because I think that I'm a serious enthusiast about a lot of things, but the way that I approach life is just like genuinely full of joy. Like I bounce around my kitchen in the morning, right? Like I wear a child-sized baby Yoda robe as I sit and drink my coffee in the morning, right? Like none of these things make sense with being a true professional, right? And at the same time, I can be a totally true professional, and I know a lot of things through a lot of different hats and a lot of different perspectives, and I can contribute to the world in a really cool way. But I'm so goofy about it. And if I was anything less than that, if I listed my profession above that, I feel I would be talking down about the way that I present myself. I would say probably 4th is food allergic. So somewhere in that mix of top 5 for sure. I'd say maybe 10 or 11 years ago, food allergic might have been 1st or 2nd, which is interesting, right? And just something to note as your experiences in the world evolve.
And I think it's so valuable for people to hear that our values can kind of ebb and flow throughout our life, right? Like
Right.
Your top 4 might ebb and flow and change as you get older, or there may be something that takes the place of something else, like that's, there you go. We're circling back all the way around to growth. And I think that is so important for people to hear. Never stop growing, right?
Yeah.
Yes. And I think I'll be the first to admit how much I've grown in just this conversation. But it's so cool because you said out loud, you live your life with so much joy. And that is so obvious. It was obvious when we met you the first time at Fair. It's obvious in our conversation with you here and just watching you and listening to the things you have to say. Candace and I often focus on joy because what we do is, we spend so much time at the beginning trying to figure out how we're going to survive. And then we figure out how we're going to reinvent our life with these new diagnoses, these new changes that have this dramatic impact on who we are and how we live. We figure out how to survive. We figure out how to reinvent. We figure out how we're going to be resilient. And then you can really tap into that joy again. So for Candace and I, one of the things that brings us that joy is music. It's something that does not cause us to have an allergic reaction. We both sort of get lost in it. Very different kinds, eclectic tastes. Today it could be one thing, tomorrow it could be another. But music across the board brings us a lot of joy. And so what I'd like to ask you is if there is a song or an artist or an album that brings you joy, and it can be like your for all time song if you want, or it can be in this moment, because as you were talking about through this conversation, these things change, right? And evolve. And
100%.
Yeah.
So I think this question is really interesting because there's one song that I have returned to in different parts of my life, and it has therefore meant different things in different parts of my life. And I think it's really interesting. It's a song called Dare You to Move by Switchfoot. And I think it's really interesting because, at certain points of my life, it meant one thing. And the example that comes to mind is when I started coming out in high school, that felt very daring. And that was something that I was like, okay, it gave me confidence in beginning to express who I was in that part of my identity. I returned to that as I was going through recognizing that I wanted to wear pants in competitive Irish dance, right? Like be daring about this and just take action, right? And I think that I can at times be somebody who reflects quite a bit, who wants to make sure that every move that I make is authentic. And sometimes I need to be reminded that just taking massive action on something is okay. But what's interesting is actually I was posed this question maybe about 3 or 4 months ago, where someone asked me what a defining song was in my life, and I responded with this song. And the person who asked me that kind of like slowly nodded and then responded, "Can I dare you to stand still?" And I found that contradiction to be so interesting because I rely on that song so often when I feel stuck, but I also struggle as a person to sit still. And I struggle with taking a moment because I think that I recognize that life is so precious and that I want to take advantage of every second that I can. That at times I can be that person who just takes so much action that I forget that there is a value in life of sitting still. And I have been reflecting on that question since I was asked. And I think that my response to his question is that dare you to move can be you are dared to move and you say no. And in the same way that we were talking before, where if it's not a hell yes, then it's a no, that this can be applied in a really like inverse mentality, but in a fun and challenging way. But that song to me represents growth, and has represented growth at so many different stages that I find it interesting to return to the same lyrics and then just recognize how this has represented different things at different parts of my life.
It's beautiful.
That was such a wonderful, thorough answer. And now I've got to go listen to the lyrics of it and like really pay attention and maybe do a little daring myself.
Yes, it's just this whole conversation has been such a powerful reminder, I think, to all of us. I hope that, our listeners feel the same way, because Debbie and I are probably going to be talking about this conversation the rest of the day. Just thank you, Maeve, for all of your wisdom, for all that you inspire others to do. Can you just quickly share how people can find you, your website,
Absolutely.
social media?
So the easiest place to find me is Instagram or on my website. So my Instagram is at _Maeve Willis. So that's MAEVE Willis. And then my mental performance coaching is at ATG Mental Performance. And then my mental performance coaching website is againstthegrainmentalperformance.com.
Awesome. And we'll include all of this, the links to everything in our show notes. And again, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day in your training to be with us. We hope that we can have another conversation with you very soon.
This is a blast. Thank you.
Until next time.
Thank you for joining us today on In the Tall Grass. Visit us at 2alphagals.com. That's TWOalphagals.com. Or you can find us on Instagram and Facebook at 2alphagals. If you enjoyed listening, please leave a review and help us grow this community.
We're all faced with obstacles on our journey, whether it be food allergies or tick-borne diseases. You might outgrow the reactions, but you won't outgrow the person you become. Ticks suck, but life doesn't have to.